Ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to welcome the legendary singer-songwriter, Mr. John B. Sebastian. Thanks so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for your interest.
I think most stories are best from the beginning, but this is a question I've been asking lately that has gotten some interesting answers. Who is John B. Sebastian?
A guitar player.
What was life like growing up?
Well, I grew up in Greenwich Village, so I had it was a perfect point of departure for what was going to become this 60s musical world. And I was sort of the youngest of a crowd because I was a harmonica player, often was getting work with more established folk and generally bluesy kind of folk performers of that era. And so I was sort of the youngest in a very interesting scene at that time, and it kind of gave me a nice jumping off point for the Spoonful and what was to all follow, the next generation of folk, blues, country related music.
And what kind of music were you listening to growing up?
I was exposed to a pretty broad spectrum. My father was a classical musician, so I was going to concerts, hearing him play with orchestras. My mother was in radio, so I was hearing sort of big band and pop music of the era on the radio. And as I was growing up, I began to have, because I lived right across from Washington Square Park, I began to have this sort of petri dish of folk music on Sundays, which was this hootenanny that happened in the park every Sunday.
Can you remember the first song that you ever wrote?
Yeah, I think it was Shepherds Call Her Iphigenia. That's with a PH. They needed, at my prep school, a song to fit in a Shakespeare play that had to sound vaguely English folk ballady, and I just said, okay, wait, I think I can do that. So that goes to Richard Rodgers, one of our great songwriters, who was asked, what comes first, the music or the lyrics? And his answer was, first comes the phone call, because you have to sometimes be asked to do something to produce a piece of work.
Tell us a little bit about this band that was around called the Even Dozen Jug Band.
It started out kind of at the stimulus of a wonderful producer by the name of Paul Rothchild, who would later produce The Doors and Janis and just about everybody on Elektra Records for a 5-6 year period, who had noticed that the coolest thing on the folk scene at that moment was the Jim Kweskin Jug Band. He sort of pointed us towards this type of music and said, we could make a record, we could have some fun here. And that's really how it was, not only the start of the band, but that was the start of that's the first time I earned a session fee.
Well, what about the album you did with Billy Fair?
You may have scooped the Even Dozen Jug Band. Billy Fair was before, I think, the Even Dozen.
But it was unpaid.
It might have been a much more informal kind of an arrangement. Because you got to remember that in that neighborhood, we were all commies at that time.
I got you. Going forward from there, the Lovin Spoonful, what was going through your mind when that was forming, and what was it that you had in mind?
Well, I think what we had in mind was really what happened. It just got misnamed. What we were interested in doing was being in a band that could include a tune by Elmore James and could still have a kind of like a weeping guitar imitation of Floyd Kramer. I guess the combo for us was more country and blues. but instead we got called folk rock. Ooh, thanks, guys. Love that name.
Well, what about Woodstock? What was it like playing there?
That was absolutely shattering. That was an amazing event, and really, rather than direct too much of the energy towards me, really that show was about the audience and not about the performers. And the performers, I think, responded by not playing very well.
Yeah, I've read some really interesting stories. You've worked with a lot of great artists. I mean, like Fred Neil, wow. Judy Collins, Bob Dylan, and then I think it was not an uncredited, but you were using a pseudonym for The Doors.
Yeah, yep.
Has there been anyone that you've worked with that you were especially blown away to work with?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just starting with your little list there. Mm-hmm. Timmy Hardin, Freddie Neil. When I first started playing with Freddie, I did not know about Fred Neil. I was introduced to Fred Neil as I was playing the first few tunes with him, and just reacting to this spectacular voice and how all of a sudden he had turned this little folk club into like an Elvis concert. The women were like ready to jump over the tables. It was spectacular. As recently as the late 80s, I was playing routinely with Johnny Johnson, a great pianist on so many of those Chuck Berry classics, and in fact, the co-composer of some of those things, I would think, by a modern definition. In fact, I'm coming up on a gig with Hubert Sumlin that is just something that I adore doing. Playing with Yank Rachel in the 90s was an astonishing thing. This is a wonderful blues mandolinist who began his career in the jug band era. So I never thought I'd meet a real jug bander, but I did. So
I was reading something that somebody who had covered one of your songs said, and he said that sometimes when you have a certain song that becomes famous, some artists start to kind of resent the song. And there are some songs that you've had that have become extremely famous and well-loved, like Do You Believe in Magic? How do you feel about a song like that? Because, I mean, it was number 216 on the Rolling Stones list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. Do you ever get tired of playing it?
No. It is my great privilege to have gotten that little thunderbolt, and so I will happily play that until they're ready to pack me on ice.
Well, how did that song come to be?
It came to be in a little club called the Night Owl Cafe, where, a previously kind of a folk crowd was suddenly changing into the beginnings of a rock and roll crowd. And Zali and I noticed a young girl dancing in the back of the room. Now, this was a room that did not, by New York cabaret law, allow dancing. So it wasn't something that happened frequently. In fact, when we first started playing this club, the thing that was happening in the audience was chess playing. So you can imagine, I mean, this was a challenging audience. And to see finally a gal that had come from Brooklyn or the Bronx or Queens somewhere and was just dancing our way in the back of the room. That's really what that song is all about.
Well, Mr. Sebastian, do you in fact believe in magic?
I was taught to believe in magic. I in fact inherited a great magician's trunk when I was very young. And I think that Paul Hartman, who went on to be a great television actor in things like Mayberry RFD, wonderful hang-jowled guy by that time, but I had known him since I was 5, so he was quite youthful when I began my friendship with him. But at the end of his magic career, he gave me his trunk. So Yes, in the most literal way, I do.
First of all, it's on a great album, but it was a song you wrote. The album I'm talking about was from Art Garfunkel, and it was his cover of Daydream. I love his version of that song.
I have to tell you, I do too. I think it's one of the best, maybe the best covers ever. Well, first of all, what a cast. I mean, he's got Warren Bernhardt on piano. He's got me playing the original part on the guitar. I think true to form, there may not have been a bass. I don't know whether they followed it that closely. But Steve Gadd on drums was just so great. What a great addition.
And is it true that you wrote that song in imitations of a Supreme song?
It's true. Yes, that's right.
There's another song I wanted to talk about. It was covered by the Everly Brothers. It was covered by Tom Petty. It's a chapter. It's the title of a chapter in a book coming out. And the song is Stories We Could Tell. How'd you get inspired to write that one?
I was in Nashville on a 2 or 3 week songwriting mission, and I wasn't having much success. I was living in a hotel with a room where you had a choice of listening to the television or turning on the air conditioning, because if you did both, you really couldn't hear the television. At a certain point, this idea came to me because I had been walking around. I had seen some of these famous guitars in the Country Music Hall of Fame, so that I'm afraid some of which don't even exist anymore. I had also had other experiences in my past, like the experience with Freddie Neal, of this genius who would... And Timmy Hardin, too, like this genius guy who would suddenly come in and be shattered by one substance or another. And so that was part of that verse about the museum. That guitar, the scratches on the face told of all the times he fell, singing all the stories he could tell. So, yeah.
Great song.
Thanks.
Well, tell us about the latest record. All the listeners out there need to check it out. It's called Satisfied.
Satisfied was a lot of fun to make, I can tell you. David Grisman is a wonderful ally, and I really savor my live shows with him when we can do that. And David also has a technique of recording that is very 60s. Basically, he turns on a tape recorder and you record, and then after it's done, you're done. There's no mixing, because the mixing has been done by a very skilled acoustic engineer, Dave Dennison, the first time that I came for a playback and I went back into the room, the control room, and I said, gee, I think we need a little bit more guitar. And Dave Dennison, the engineer, smiles up at me and says, play louder. So that was part of my education. I think a really great step, a great way to do this project with David. The tunes came from all over the board. Some of them were folk songs, John Hurt, old classics, Everly Brothers, B-sides. You know, we were just going all over the place, and in fact have already begun going all over the place again for another album. We just had our first couple of sessions.
If you could put it into words, what is it you like about music?
Music presents the wonderful opportunity to scratch an itch that I think musicians have, and that itch is playing. And that opportunity to play, combined with the opportunity to travel, is, I think, a great incentive, and has been my incentive. I think my father, who was a great classical musician, also kind of lived by the credo, because he was a very well-traveled musician, did not keep it to, strict classical venues. He'd end up playing in a town square, which was basically dirt beaten down by bare feet. And he'd set up his accompanist with a little electric piano, and they would do concerts. I mean, they were in Asia and Africa and a lot of places that not that many musicians were traveling to, American musicians in that day.
I have two final questions. The first one, what is your all-time favorite meal?
It was an abruzzese flavored chicken made by the mother of Tom Vinci, who is one of our great string builders, string machine builders. Actually, his father invented the string extruding machine as an afterthought after he'd invented a pasta making machine, as it's all the same. It's the same stuff. So I would very often end up at his house, and Mrs. Vinci made this chicken that had some sweet sour combination, a little balsamic vinegar that gave it this quality, and it had obviously been marinating, and it took a while to do, and it was an astonishing meal. And by 1968 or whenever that was, I had already had that meal.
It sounds good.
It was good.
Well, my last question, we get people listening to this show from all over the globe. What would you like to say to all the people listening?
I'd like to say thank you, because all of you have given me permission to do this thing that at 18 looked like an impossible dream, and to continue doing it into my 60s and hopefully beyond.
Mr. Sebastian, it has been a pleasure to do this interview.
Thank you.